In 1801, the War of the Second Coalition still raged across Europe. France and Great Britain were bitterly looking for advantages over each other, and one of the ways Britain obtained an advantage over France was to throttle her trade. The Royal Navy imposed a blockade on France and seized goods on any neutral ship caught trading with the French. This angered many neutral nations, and in response, Sweden, Prussia, Denmark, and Russia formed the League of Armed Neutrality, which sought to enforce free trade with the French. The League went against British interest, and the Admiralty dispatched a squadron under Admiral Sir Hyde Parker and Vice Admiral Horatio Nelson to the Baltic to break up the League. In December 1800, the League of Armed Neutrality was formed in St. Petersburg, consisting of the four Baltic powers Sweden, Prussia, Denmark, and Russia. The objective of the League was very simple to enforce free trade with France. Before the League was formed, Britain had seized entire convoys because they transported goods that were deemed to be contraband. This included weapons, timber, and naval supplies used to build ships. According to the League, however, a declaration from the commander of a convoy that the convoy transported no contraband should be enough for the British, and this effectively stripped their right to search ships at sea. If the British abided by the conditions set out in the League, their blockade of France would become useless. The League was clearly in the French interest, and unsurprisingly the British began to plan its demise. Tsar Paul of Russia, the main driver of the League, was pro-French, and had even ordered an embargo on all British ships. The Admiralty assembled a strong fleet at Great Yarmouth to send to the Baltic to break up the League. The fleet consisted of 20 ships of the line, 7 frigates, and many smaller ships capable of bombarding a city from a distance. Admiral Sir Hyde Parker was placed in charge of this fleet, and his second in command was Vice Admiral Horatio Nelson. By now, Nelson's reputation had suffered as a result of his affair with Lady Emma Hamilton, which started during his return to England from Egypt. Although he was the Navy's finest tactician, this scandal had worsened public opinion of him. The Admiralty decided that the best course of action was to send him to sea again. Admiral Parker was reluctant to enter the Baltic in winter, but after being convinced by Nelson, he ordered the fleet to sail and they departed Great Yarmouth on the 12th of March, 1801. The fleet reached Skagen, the northernmost part of Denmark, 7 days later. On the 21st, the fleet encountered strong winds, and Admiral Parker ordered that the fleet anchor in the Kattegat. The Danish capital of Copenhagen was the fleet's destination. Nelson initially wanted to head straight for the Russians, but Admiral Parker convinced him that starting with the Danes was the best course of action. Copenhagen was located on the island of Zealand. When the fleet weighed anchor again, they could reach Copenhagen through one of two routes. The first option was to sail directly to the city through a stretch of water called the Sound, between Denmark and Sweden. Although this was the faster option with the safest waterways, the Sound was guarded by two fortresses either side of it, both of which could fire on the British fleet. The second option was to sail around the island of Zealand, through water known as the Belt. The Belt was unguarded, but the water was more dangerous and the route was longer. Admiral Parker initially chose to travel through the Belt, but changed his mind after consulting with some of his captains. The fleet encountered the two forts as it sailed through the Sound. The Danish fort opened fire on them, but the Swedish fort did not, and the British were able to get past with only a few casualties. The fleet reached Copenhagen later the same day, on the 30th of March. When the fleet arrived at Copenhagen, it anchored in two lines about 8 kilometers north-northeast of the city. The Danish defences were formidable. The powerful Kroner battery guarded the entrance to the harbour. It was equipped with 68 guns, and as it was a fort, it had much better stability than a ship. In two parallel lines to the south of the fortress lay part of the Danish fleet and more land batteries. These batteries were much smaller than the Kroner, but still presented an obstacle to the British. The Danish fleet was an odd mix of ships. There were some proper third rates in the line, but most of them were old civilian ships and not fit to put to sea, so the Danes converted them into floating gun batteries. Despite their inability to move, some of these vessels packed formidable firepower. The water around Copenhagen contained extensive shoals, and the Danes had very accurate maps of these. To prevent the British from using the same tactics that were used at the Battle of the Nile, the Danish line anchored very close to the shoals. The larger, more modern ships of the Danish navy were anchored inside the city. If the entirety of the Danish navy engaged the English in open water, they would still have been outmatched. On the same day that they arrived, Parker and Nelson took a frigate to observe the Danish defences. After gaining more information on the Danish positions, Nelson managed to convince Parker to allow him to attack. He was wary of the danger that the shoals presented, so he planned to take the smaller ships of the squadron and leave Parker with the larger ships. The fleet rested the next day. On the 1st of April, 2 days after arriving, Nelson scouted the outer channel again. He returned to the fleet and set sail with his detachment. He took with him 12 ships of the line, 7 frigates, and many support vessels. The fleet anchored in the outer channel 3 kilometers away from the Danes. Under cover of darkness, Captain Thomas Hardy set out in a small boat and took depth measurements, leading up to and along the Danish line. He was able to get very close to the enemy, and the measurements he took would prove to be extremely valuable. Nelson had begun formulating a detailed plan on how to defeat the Danes. He had no fancy tactics to employ. He planned to line up his fleet opposing the Danes and simply outgun them. He wanted upwards of 4 ships to deal with the Turkrono battery, and after it was silenced, British Marines were to capture it. He also wanted bomb catchers, ships that specialize in land bombardment, to be in place to threaten the city so that negotiations would go smoother. The battle was to take place the next day. It seems that throughout the entirety of the battle, the wind blew towards the north, which favoured the British. By the next morning, every captain in Nelson's detachment had received a copy of his plan and understood their role in the battle to come. The British fleet weighed anchor and formed a line, with the battleships at the front. Even before the battle started, they found themselves down a ship. The previous day, HMS Agamemnon had anchored too closely to the shoals, and ended up stranded on them before being able to turn. The fleet sailed towards the Danes. The first British ship, HMS Edgar, passed 4 Danish ships and anchored opposite the fifth. As the fleets exchanged fire, more British ships took up places opposite to Danish ships. Some frigates moved to the head of the Danish line. When most British ships were in place, 2 more ships ran aground on the shoals. Nelson had to reposition some of his ships to account for this, and the northern end of his line was much weaker than intended. All ships were in place 2 hours after they weighed anchor. Although they had some initial setbacks, over the next 2 hours the British slowly took control of the battle as their guns began to batter the Danish. Nelson's force had more powerful ships and better crews, but the Danes were resilient, and this resulted in very intense fighting. To Admiral Parker, it did not seem as though the British were winning. Smoke from the cannons obscured his view, and at 1:30 he decided to call off the attack. He had a signal sent which ordered the British to retreat. Nelson's response to the signal would become very famous. In short, Nelson disregarded the signal. He could see that they were winning the battle, and to retreat now would be a bad idea. According to legend, Nelson placed his telescope to his blind eye and said, "I really cannot see the signal," as he was disobeying it. This is where the saying "to turn a blind eye" comes from. Based on accounts of the battle written directly afterwards, this probably didn't happen though. It was a rumor circulated some years after the battle, and when included in a historian's account, it effectively became fact in the eyes of the public. Nelson was right to disobey the signal. Shortly afterwards, 3 Danish ships tried to escape, but 2 of them sank due to damage they had sustained during the battle. British gunnery was beginning to take a heavy toll on the Danes, and by 2 in the afternoon, most Danish ships had stopped firing and struck their colours. British boarding parties were sent out to take control of these ships, but in some cases the surrendered ships fired on them. Naturally, the British fired back. Nelson sensed an opportunity to find a diplomatic end to the battle. The Crown Prince of Denmark was watching the battle from the shore, and under a flag of truce, Nelson sent a letter to him proposing an end to hostilities. After a few back and forth letters, a truce was agreed. Nelson cleverly worded his last letter so that if the Danes accepted the truce, they would also be conceding defeat. 12 Danish ships were taken by the British after Nelson ordered a ceasefire. The Danes had done the same. The battle was over, with Britain victorious. That afternoon, the Danish flagship blew up as a result of a rampant fire that the crew were unable to put out. The Battle of Copenhagen was less bloody than the Battle of the Nile. This is in large part due to Nelson's ceasefire order. Danish casualties could have been significantly higher. Strangely enough, we have no precise tally for Danish losses, although the best estimate is about 800 killed and 900 wounded, with a further 2,000 captured by the British. British losses were more accurately recorded, with 255 killed and 685 wounded. The British lost no ships, whereas the Danish lost 15 ships, 7 of which were ships of the line. The British kept one captured ship and burnt the rest. Admiral Parker left diplomatic matters to Nelson. The morning after the battle was fought, Nelson entered Copenhagen to negotiate with Crown Prince Frederick. The negotiations went poorly as the Danish insisted on free trade. The two sides instead settled on a 14-week armistice. Denmark would temporarily leave the League and allow the British to access Copenhagen, who in turn would not bombard the city and release all Danish prisoners. This armistice would allow Britain to deal with Russia. After this, the British found out that Tsar Paul had been assassinated and replaced by his son Alexander. As Alexander was anti-French, this event made the breakup of the League very likely. Nonetheless, Nelson was not convinced. He still wanted to attack the Russians. A month after the battle, Admiral Parker was recalled to Britain and Nelson was given command of the fleet. The Admiralty had deemed Parker incompetent based on his actions at the battle. Nelson left a detachment of ships to watch the Swedes and set off after the Russians with two-thirds of his fleet. He did not find a fleet, and after hearing that negotiations were taking place, he withdrew back to Copenhagen. The League was ultimately terminated, the goal of the expedition achieved. The Baltic nations still traded with the French, although now there was less military might behind the trade. Nelson and his fleet returned to England with another feather in his cap.